Hello, welcome to another episode of Media Diet Comics Commentary. My name is Heath, and I'm here today to talk to you about 2 issues of a new Warhammer 40,000 miniseries published by Marvel called Marneus Calgar. Just recently started coming out. The first issue, it looks like, is dated December, and it's a new Warhammer tie-in comic, licensed comic, out by Marvel. These first 2 issues were written by Kieran Gillen and drawn by Jason Burrows, or Jocelyn Burrows. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. If you know, let me know in the comments below. And the second cover has a really nice artwork by James Stocco, and I believe that he also will draw the next issue's cover. And it's an interesting comic to follow up the D&D comics from yesterday. If you're not familiar with Warhammer, it's a miniatures war game made by Games Workshop out of the UK. It's been around since the 80s, and there have been various games over the years, but there's 2 main stripes. There's their fantasy game, Warhammer Fantasy, or just Warhammer, and then Warhammer 40,000, or Warhammer 40K, as some players call it, which is the science fiction game. And it's not rooted in actual history, so it is totally just a fantastic fictional game, but it is a miniatures war game. And over the years, they've had a large number of novels, tie-in novels, published related to the game. And they've also had a number of comics, but not many major comics. Black Library, which is the publishing imprint for Games Workshop, did a 63-64 issue run of something called Warhammer Monthly from like 1998 to 2003. But then otherwise, there have just been miniseries here and there published by Boom Studios or Titan Books, which does a lot of tie-in comics, including Doctor Who currently. So not a lot of major comics related to Warhammer, other than the Warhammer Monthly series, which was pretty much like 2000 AD. It was an anthology book, had a number of different storylines taking place in the various Warhammer worlds, and kind of introduced some new talent, both writers as well as artists, much like 2008 AD and other British anthology comics did, Eagle, Action back in the day, and stuff like that. So this comic published by Marvel is probably the biggest tie-in comic that Warhammer has ever done. And it's an interesting time for it to be coming out because there's a new edition of Warhammer out not too long ago. I believe it's the 9th edition. There's a relatively new edition of the Warhammer role-playing game, as well as the Warhammer 40K role-playing game, also out. Those are licensed games. I think Cubicle 7. Anyway, I'll have to look into that. So this comic is interesting in terms of timing as well as scale, because the visibility that this will get Warhammer is perhaps larger than it would normally get. So how is it as a comic? It is not bad. I mean, Burroughs' art is pretty cool, and there are moments in the book. Let me just show you, like this 2-page spread in the first issue, where he actually gets some scale and scope that's relatively cool. I was going to compare him to another artist, but I think I'll hold shy of that. And the story is also interesting. It's about Marneus Calgar, who's chapter master for the Ultramarines, which is kind of the elite good fighting force for the Emperor in the Warhammer 40K realm. And he's returning to a planet called Nova Thulium, where he was actually initially trained as a youth when he first started his journey to become an Ultramarine. And so it's a combination of their return to the planet and their combat and fight with the heretics who are currently kind of holding the planet down, and flashback to his childhood and his training and development on Nova Thulium. There's quite a bit of pretty well-handled exposition. It doesn't go into the exposition like the miniature war games rulebooks do in terms of who the Emperor is and stuff like that. There's like a relatively brief just synopsis introduction like they do in the front of most Marvel comics these days to let you know what's what. But then there's occasionally stuff like this where you can see a map of the star system or the solar system to see where this particular planet fits in. There's a little data sheet actually about the planet, and so it does situate you and ground you in the world as well as tell the story. And the story is interesting. I mean, the current time stuff isn't so interesting, but the flashback to his childhood and his development. Here's some more information about Thulium Minor. Here's an image of a creature on the planet that's kind of reminiscent of the Remmerhaz in the D&D comic. But the flashback to his childhood is probably the most interesting stuff in the comic. It doesn't really go where you think it's going to go. I had a sense as a reader of where I thought it was going to go, and then there's kind of a twist. So there's kind of a neat turn there. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. I don't think there are too many issues left, maybe even just one. And so I'm not too sure how much further the story will go. But if Marneus Calgar is a character in Warhammer 40k, this is a decent backstory and introduction to his origin. Also of interest in the comic is how many marketing, I guess, placements or mentions there are for Warhammer related stuff. Here's an ad for some McFarlane Toys licensed pictures or character toys, including an unpainted one, very similar to the actual miniature in the game. There's a number of video game related ads in the comic as well. Let's see if I can find one here. Well, in the second issue, they're all over the place. Warhammer Combat Cards, which I think is a mobile game. Here's an ad for the current starter set for the current edition. And then in the second issue, I think is the issue. Here it is. So we've got a console game for Total War. We have another console game for Mechanicus. We have an ad for a tie-in novel. Start your Warhammer 40,000 reading journey here. That ad says. This ad says great first reads, additional tie-in novels coming to us from Black Library. And then there's another ad. There's a Necromunda console game as well. Here we go. Necromunda Underhive Wars. So the comic is very much and merch. So if you want to get shirts and hats, there you go. So the comic is very much a tent pole to bring Warhammer to a new audience, and that's interesting as a comic. So biggest licensed comic that they've done, as far as I know, other than Boom Studios and Titan Books. First with Marvel, decent art, relatively decent story, lots of ads for Games Workshop, and so I'm actually kind of curious what the licensing arrangement was, because this is almost like a Games Workshop house organ. It might as well be an issue of White Dwarf, if you think about it. But an interesting comic, and reads relatively well. That's one thing that they've done well with the Warhammer miniature world, is that the story and lore and legend around it and the fiction around it is relatively rich and interesting, and so there's plenty to work on. So not a bad comic. And if you're not familiar with Warhammer, but you like science fiction or you like futuristic military stuff, be sure to check it out. And the art, as I mentioned, the cover to number 2 and the cover image that I saw for number 3, both I think by James Stokoe. This is the number 3 kind of preview art. Some interesting styling there for Warhammer, which opens up the opportunity for some perhaps even additional independent artists. There's a lot of directions that this could go. So Warhammer 40,000, Marneus Calgar, number 1 and 2, not a bad read. Check it out. Have a good Sunday.